I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. And well, today I'm very happy and lucky to be joined by another doctor. It's pretty awesome. It's one of those amazing things with this podcast that we started off with me talking to my buddies, and now we somehow get the chance to talk to bishops and doctors and experts, and it's pretty incredible. I kind of have to pinch myself and wonder how exactly this happened. But for everyone who's been here from the beginning, you all appreciate it as much as I do. I'm very sure of that. So today we're joined by Dr. Naveen Maliakkal, who's going to talk to us about nutrition. But first, he's going to tell us a little bit about himself. I was introduced to him by Dominic Cagesso. Everyone knows him, obviously a big part of the Catholic Family Podcast, who runs the Divine Poetry. Every Tuesday, he's done the Glorious Heritage book production, cartoons, etc. Everybody should know him by now. And he recommended that I get in touch with Dr. Maliakkal to talk about, well, I don't know, talk about something, to talk about, health or nutrition. And that's, again, what we're going to talk about today is nutrition and perhaps diets, just kind of pick the doctor's brain a little bit. So because if we can talk to a traditional Catholic doctor, then, well, we certainly should. So doctor, sorry for the long preamble, but maybe if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what you do, and then we'll get into the topic after that.
Hi, my name's Naveen Maliakkal. I am the physician who owns Florida Low Carb Direct Primary Care. So full disclosure, I run a low carb practice. So I do have, that disclosure to disclose. And obviously I have an interest in nutrition based on that background. I'm an MD who, finished residency a few years ago, and have started my own practice, but I work nights, essentially to make the bills work at a hospital around here in Florida. So kind of my journey into nutrition was actually a little bit different than most people. In medical school, I kind of realized that I don't really know much of anything about nutrition. You get maybe 1 day, maybe 2 days in medical school at most, in terms of what your nutrition education is. There's not much. Like you essentially just get told what the guidelines are in terms of, cholesterol, grains, whatever. And that's just kind of what people roll with.
So here's the food pyramid. Next.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Essentially like the my plate or the food pyramid of the day. And you can get into the history of, the AHA being bankrolled by Procter and Gamble to start and things like that. And, they also happened to own Crisco at that time. But that's a whole topic in and of itself. But, it was more almost like a hypocrisy kind of a thing. Like, I was, overweight, not very active, but it's like, if you're going to tell someone to make a change in lifestyle, then you better, it's not like taking a chemo drug or something where there's a massive undesirability of it. Like if you telling someone else to get healthier, but you don't do it yourself, it seems like, why should I even listen to you? The corollary in the Catholic faith is you're supposed to still listen to the priest, even if he's not a holy man himself. But if he's openly, in sin, that'll scandalize anyone, regardless of, what the intellect should tell you about still following him because he's a man of God. There's no different with a doctor. If your endocrinologist is 300 pounds and telling you to lose weight, it's hard to believe him because his advice was so good. He'd probably be following it himself. So I started eliminating things like one by one. So essentially I eliminated sugar. Then I messed around and eliminated grains. And actually the most dramatic improvement in my life was when I eliminated vegetables. And all of a sudden, particularly my energy went up, all my gut issues went away. Losing weight after putting it on when after dietary indiscretion was effortless. So it was really eye-opening. And then after doing it for 5-6 months, you're like, well, why am I not dead?
And so real quick, I got to ask too. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm thinking that myself. That sounds miserable and I probably would die. But so when you say eliminate, do you mean gone, like gone, or are you saying gone. Mostly cut out? Gone, like gone.
Gone. So I eliminated that. So I because I was just well, the reason I eliminated sugar first was because of a lecture by a pediatric endocrinologist that's famous in nutrition circles called Sugar, a Bitter Truth by Robert Lustig, which was kind of where I went down the sugar route. If you're down that particular route of nutrition, then you're familiar with people like, Gary Taubes, who wrote, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and The Case Against Sugar. And then, you kind of go into it and just be like, well, what happens if I eliminate the carbs? So hence essentially eliminating grains. and things like that. So you're stuck with like, low carb vegetables and like maybe some legumes here and there and some meat. And then just on a whim, just being like, oh, let me just eliminate these things and just see how I feel. And like, I used to think that you're supposed to have abdominal pain after all these meals and essentially like IBS symptoms and things like that. And it's just like, oh, it's just a normal course of business. But then when I got rid of it, it's just like, wow, I can eat like 3 pounds of beef and I feel flat and I feel like in my stomach, not flat energy wise. And I feel like I can go about my day. Whereas, if I eat, a pound of pasta or something like that, you're down for the count. Like it's nap time.
That's true.
Yeah. So it's
So,
it's
so,
one of those
so
things.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but so
Yeah.
real quickly, so I'm just curious of how did you feel? So when you cut sugar first, did you go? Are you going weeks before you cut carbs as well, or months,
Oh, months.
years,
It was months.
months?
So it was
Okay.
like there was like a couple week withdrawal period almost for each thing with respect to the grains and the sugar. And to me, that's kind of me essentially probably being what we call insulin resistant or metabolically inflexible. So think of your body as essentially like it's a little bit more complicated than this, but kind of like a dual fuel engine. You can run on carbs or you can run on fat and the byproducts of fat metabolism like ketones. So
Hmm.
when you're metabolically dysfunctional, you may have glucose metabolism problems, but you definitely have problems tapping into fat. You can almost think of someone who's obese, even if they're not eating very much and they're still fat, as someone who has like a bank account that they can keep depositing into, but they can't withdraw from. So they're kind of
Hmm.
broken metabolically to be able to, actually tap into the bank account of stored energy, which is your adipose tissue, your fat cells. So there probably was some withdrawal because you're going from essentially a quick, cheap fuel. It's almost like burning NOS to, kind of a long acting diesel fuel, right? Which is fat. And it just takes a while for some people's bodies to flip. Some people who are metabolically healthy, they can flip real quick. So you have some serious like side effects and people talk about the keto flu, which actually you just cure with electrolytes. So you just consume more salt because actually the first thing that happens is when you crash when we talk about insulin resistance, you're talking effectively about having too much insulin in the body because you're harming yourself metabolically. Now, there are various theories about this. Is it the seed oils? Is it just too many carbs? Is it sugar? There's different schools of thought on what is causing that in terms of what the industrial is, or if it's just refined grains, whatever your kind of hypothesis is. But when you have this, when it leads to is insulin resistance, meaning your cells don't essentially burn energy like they should. And one of that manifestations is your pancreas having to release more insulin in order to be able to carry out your body functions, like, maintain glucose levels and things like that. Well, over time, what can happen is certain organs can be resistant to insulin, but your kidneys might not be. So when we talk about like salt sensitive hypertension, so everyone who has got high blood pressure wants to avoid salt, that's probably the wrong idea, because what it is the insulin resistance leads the pancreas to keeping high insulin levels, but your kidney is still responding exquisitely to the insulin. And insulin actually tells the kidney to hold on to salt. So if you have someone who's got hypertension, I actually think of it as insulin resistance until proven otherwise. And avoiding the salt might allow you to hold on to less salt when the insulin tells your kidney to hold on to salt. But really what you should be doing is getting rid of the excess insulin, getting more insulin sensitive. And that's why kind of when you think about hypertension, you could treat it with meds. You could treat it by trying to cut salt, or you could treat it with a ketogenic diet. And one of the first things that you notice with these low carb diets is for people who experience this is they start urinating out a ton of salt, and it makes them feel really dehydrated and really off. And actually, they find that when they can replace the salt, they actually feel better. But it's almost like it's very quick, and it used to be an old school way for bodybuilders to actually cut weight before shows, was to go very, very low carb. Naturiste is the medical term for it. And then make weight and then try to hydrate back up because your muscles need to look nice from their perspective. But this stuff is actually, when you go into it, it's interesting. This stuff goes back to like the 30s, like this type of research, the ketogenic diet for epilepsy and things like that. And it kind of points toward a kind of a general principle that I think we've lost in medicine. Now, granted, like I'm speaking from an American perspective. I do not know what medicine is like in Europe. I just don't. Right. And how things work in
A
Germany.
bit better, but yeah, or a bit more holistic. I should say, maybe not better, but different. Yeah.
Well, the way you almost feel about it in America, and there's a bunch of potential factors as to why this is. It's almost like we were made as an accident.
Mm.
That our existence is almost an accident, and therefore accidents can have fundamental fundamental errors in them that humans need to fix. Almost as if
Hmm.
like you hear this sometimes, like, oh, we should put statins in the water or fluoride in the water or Ozempic probably now in the water. It's almost as if we were made with a deficiency for a particular drug, and our entire existence as a species has been waiting for this drug to come along to fix this deficiency that we were born with. Um,
That's
and
so well said. I've thought that for years, but I've never been able to formulate it in my head that well. That is, I love that. That's so absolutely spot on true. Anyway, continue, please.
there's a rejection of the fact that you were designed, that you were made for a purpose. To be honest, like the most obvious example is with particular people who have particular views on whether they are a particular thing. I don't know if the channel get demonetized if we are too specific on this nature, but we have an issue where in medicine, we are normalizing diseases as you're normalizing disorder, right? And you're telling them that things that are ordered are somewhat disordered. For example, eating like a low carb diet, that'll kill you. But saying that your name is Steve and instead of Susan, that's somehow ordered. That is somehow the way things are supposed to be, and it gets to this kind of this view of man as ultimately his own master. And if you're not, a master of, yourself, right? Truly, if someone made you, if someone is above you, then you're made with a particular purpose. There are certain universal laws about existence that exist that you can't violate, that you can't bend or break to your own will. From the almost like the anti kind of like Marxist kind of view, where if you have this malleable human nature, right, we can turn man into whatever we want to. They are almost a view of that in medicine with respect to the body. We can do whatever we want to get whatever outcome we want, and almost the only outcome that isn't acceptable is that which is the most natural. That is the one that admits that there's not much we can do to directly intervene to save someone's life or to prolong their life or to make their life better. Now, granted, I would say that medicine is actually quite good at the acute interventions. You break your leg, you want a surgeon, right? You got a heart attack, you want someone to put in a stent. But in terms of preventing, we can see that it's an abject failure. Like if you look at the obesity rates, the childhood obesity rates, the diabetes rates, right? Even the cancer rates for all the screening and for all the lifestyle things that people recommend, you haven't made a dent in that. And that's why they waste billions of dollars on these cancer drugs, and they don't provide much benefit anyway. So if medicine was honest with itself, it would essentially dump the entire paradigm in terms of, what we've been recommending doesn't seem to be working. But instead, it's just more of a doubling down on, oh, it's just people aren't listening, or we just need better drugs. It seems, and I will say, it makes a patient feel probably, and I actually do know this, it makes them feel terrible because they do the things that their doctor is telling them, right? It's not their fault, but it is. But when they feel like, oh, well, I'm doing all the right things and nothing's working out, you can get this fatalism, right? And this idea that, well, nothing matters. I can eat whatever I want and I'm still going to feel, garbage, or I'm still going to be overweight, or there's not much I can do for my health outside of what my doctor can prescribe me because none of these lifestyle things have helped. And I think it's one of those things that it's tough because you have to realize that it's not your fault because you've been told the wrong things. You've just been told the wrong things by a lot of people. But it is in your control. It just means that you have to do things that are a lot different than what you've been told your entire life.
Well, and I love that you bring up how it's almost idealistic. It's almost like a humanistic problem. That's so true, and it's something we saw here. I told the story before, so I'll be really brief. But my daughter had a really bad bladder infection. I think it was an infection a couple years ago, and we brought her to a children's doctor, and he's asking us questions, and he just said, okay, is she vaccinated? And we said, no, she's not vaccinated. And he just kind of sat back and he goes, and this is in German, obviously, so I'm not translating perfectly, but pretty much says, well, then you have an enemy in me. And it was just kind of like, wait, what? I mean, okay. I mean, if you want to say, hey, she should have been vaccinated, or yeah, okay, but he was like offended, like he was hurt Like he was like, how could you possibly do that? And it was such a bizarre reaction because to me it just showed that it's an ideology. It's not just science or medicine, whatever you want to call it. It was, hey, this is my belief system. Like I believe that. To me, that was so bizarre. Maybe you feel differently, doctor. I don't know, but for me, it was like, wait, hold on a second. You can tell me if it's what you think is wrong medically, but don't get offended by it. And I think to me, it showed. I think you're absolutely right. It's this weird, almost a worship of falsity. So much of this stuff is, and as you said, some of it's really good, and some you can benefit from it, but there's so much of it that's just not. And they act like it is this absolute proven science or whatever you want to call it that no one can question, and it's just not. It's a
Well,
very strange thing.
you're seeing that now, right? With, I don't know how free YouTubers are to talk about what happened in the last, 3-4 years with
More
respect
free
to.
than you would expect, actually. Pretty okay
So you have
nowadays.
Francis Collins, right? Who ran, I believe, the NIH, like admitting like the 6 feet thing was just a bunch of nonsense. And like during the pandemic, he's the one strumming on a guitar, singing like songs about how we need to separate, 6 feet away. And now he's admitting there's like no evidence. There was no evidence for this. You have, people who will tell you a drug is safe, even though it's only existed for like 4 years, right? And it's just like you can have all these studies, for example, and you could have data that's saying it's safe, but you can't tell someone taking a drug for 10 years is going to be safe until someone has taken that drug for 10 years. Like that seems like a very basic point of
Right.
logic. And then in America, you have some interesting things that, I think doctors don't have good answers for, regardless of your position. In America, vaccine companies cannot be sued for complications from their vaccine in civil court. The government can sue them. That can happen. And you can sue for lack of efficacy, I believe, but you can't actually sue for a complication, even if it's expected from that. And that's I believe the act, I can't remember the name of the act off the top of my head, was in 86 or 88 at that point. And it's very hard. I don't think any doctor's got a good answer for, well, if these things are as safe as you said, why won't these companies open themselves up to, essentially civil lawsuit if they weren't safe? And I don't think any doctor has a good answer for that. And you see the response to, there's almost a similar response for people not taking the COVID vaccine for whatever reason. Like, you're an 18-year-old athlete and you're super healthy and it's not going to be much benefit. And now we're seeing that, I think Vinay Prasad did a good video on essentially the risks of it. And like there's just probably just like objectively not a benefit in those people, those young men who are getting myocarditis with very little benefit to their immune system with respect to COVID. And now that's starting to become like a more mainstream thing, but you couldn't talk about that 3 years ago, 2 years ago. If you refused, the vaccine, you were thought of as like, yeah, an enemy of the people. You're the one who got grandma sick, right? You're the reason my father died, that kind of a mentality. And it really does medicine harm. And like we don't even have to go into the Catholic issues with respect to that. For example, you go to your OBGYN clinic as a woman, and you'll never find a profession in some cases where they have more exposure to life and more antipathy towards it. Because the first thing that you'll be asked a lot of the time after you've had your pregnancy, or if you had a C-section, is like, well, do you want a tubal while I'm down here? Or, do you want, what kind of contraception do you want after you're having a pregnancy? There's no concept of that. So there is a culture in medicine that has been so self-reinforcing, and I can't say that they're in a bubble almost. I mean, they are educationally, right? Because a lot of them come from the university system, and we can go into, the problems of the university system in terms of the ideologies that get, imposed in there, and that's where all these
It's
people
probably another podcast, honestly. I think that
Yeah.
would be a very. I mean, let's save that because that's a great point. I think I would love to talk to you again about, how does this become what it's become? I mean, maybe a little bit about the history of the medicine, in the last 100 years, because I think that is a really interesting point of how does it become an ideology, where I don't think that was the case 100 years ago. I mean, I haven't studied it, but to me, it seems like this is a much more modern issue, semi-modern, maybe the last 150 years or so, and that would be very interesting. But I think that's a good idea to save that for another one, because I think we could go a good hour probably on that topic itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think in large part, like we were getting to earlier, there's, I think, a difference. I mean, maybe 100 years ago, I think there's probably more humility in society, probably because societies were either de facto because of whatever vestiges they had of the Catholic faith, or were Catholic to some degree, that there is a humility there. But once you've replaced God with man as your own God, right? Then
Yeah.
what is there a need to be humble about?
Well,
From
can
that
you
perspective.
imagine a nun sitting across from you, a sister? They actually still call, here in Germany, they call, I can't think of the English word for it, nurses. They call nurses sisters, because, well, that's what they were generally. They were nuns. And can you imagine a nun sitting across and I say, yeah, my daughter's really sick. Oh, was she vaccinated? No. Then you have an enemy in me. I mean, I don't think I can picture that. I don't think a nun would be saying that to my face. It's so exactly right.
Well,
I mean, they'd be
we've
treating it with
also
humility and kindness.
we've also well, and that's another thing in America. We can get into the history of government interventions that essentially made charity care impossible,
Hmm.
like financially, right? Like, hospitals used to be run by nuns and used to be run by the Catholic Church. Now, granted, crisis aside, obviously that's going to put a dent in things, right? With respect to that, whatever your take on the crisis, is, but what the United States government did in terms of occupational licensing, Medicare, Medicaid, and the financialization of healthcare through their interventions, inflation, essentially central banking, had made charity care impossible. So you don't have even that mentality of people, coming who run the medicine side of things, coming at it like the Catholic Church did for, gosh, centuries, maybe even millennia, depending on when the first Catholic hospital was. It probably wasn't too far away from the apostles, to be honest, in terms of just caring for the sick.
Sure.
So, there's a lot there, but yeah. And then, when it comes to the nutrition aspect of things, you do see people just essentially normalizing, like, oh, being on 4 or 5 meds is normal. Having chronic pains is a normal thing. But for example, how many doctors? So I'm a big knees over toes guy fan. Have you ever heard of Ben Patrick? So he does the ATG training method. One of the best things, and he didn't invent this, one of the best things you can do for chronic knee pain is actually to walk backwards. How many times have you ever heard your mother, who's like 60, dealing with osteoarthritis, told to by her doctor, what you need to do? You just need to start walking up backwards in a hill, or if you can't do that, walking backwards on flat ground, or even backwards in a pool, or having a sled harness to you and then walking backwards that way with some resistance, or walking backwards on a treadmill. It's one of the best things you can do for knee pain, but nobody actually talks about that. The first thing is like, okay, NSAIDs, ibuprofen, things like that. And in fact, the guy who invented RICE, which is rest, ice, compression, elevation, like in the 10, 15 years ago, said I was completely wrong about that paradigm. But no, that's common. That's the common recommendation if you get an injury still, even though he himself renounced it. So you get these kind of stickiness, and also there's a well, I think there's a Japanese phrase, right? Or no, maybe it's not. I can't remember it all, but like the origin of it. But if you're a hammer, all you see is a nail. If you've been trained your entire career to prescribe medications, right, to refer people for surgery, then when someone comes along with a problem and it doesn't fit that box, well, what do? Do you swallow your pride and try to learn something new, or do you try to hammer in that screw or that bolt instead of realizing it's not a nail?
I've experienced that myself. I played football, American football, for anyone wondering, for a couple of years, enough to really hurt my neck pretty good, or seemingly so. And anyway, I tried for a good 10 years to get it fixed through every possible source. And it seems now the best way for me to cure it. And doctor, maybe tell me if I'm wrong, but to me, it seems like it's actually my diet. It is actually inflammation, maybe caused by an injury. And it was, if I pretty much stop eating sugar and don't drink alcohol, my neck feels better. It's pretty incredible. And it's something that I went to easily a dozen different doctors over those years, and no one even came close to mentioning diet. Not even remotely close.
I'll say that's not surprising to me, and I'll say it in this sense. If your pain was neuropathic in nature, especially, meaning that your pain was actually more driven by the nerves and the inflammation around the nerves, then by eliminating fructose, you're eliminating an inflammatory signal to the nerves. By eliminating, alcohol? Oh, alcohol is a neurotoxin, straight up.
Dang it.
So
I live in Bavaria. This is bad news for me, man.
But like eliminating those things, eliminating seed oils, so canola oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, peanut oil. Even, I mean, in Europe, this isn't as much of a problem. In America, I mean, I treat all olive oil and all
Hmm.
avocado oil pretty much as fake. In fact, University of California, Davis did a study in 2013 showing that 85% of avocado oil is either fake, meaning adulterated with seed oils, or rancid on the shelf. So like I essentially trust only beef tallow, beef fat, and butter. From that perspective as a fat. But even a ketogenic diet shows significant effects in improving nerve metabolism, in improving, reducing inflammation through something called the NLRP3 inflammasome. Um, so there's plenty of data, and we've known from a long time that the ketogenic diet and low carb diets are effective in nerve health, because it's that was the first treatment for like epilepsy, was a ketogenic diet. And it's still the most effective, relative to any of the drugs. It's most studied in children. There were problems with that because I think they were too low in protein, and they would just start pumping them full of oil essentially to get to like 90% of their calories from fat, which is a lot for a kid who's growing, right? You need some protein with that too, and not pumping them full of oil. But there's a great book by a psychiatrist named Chris Palmer called Brain Energy. There's also another book by Georgia Ede called, I'm blanking on the name of it. I was listening to it on Audible. But those two books are actually quite good in terms of describing what the impact is of these neurological disorders. So, but not just epilepsy, we're talking psychiatric disorders as well: depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, addiction, on metabolism. And it's another thing to kind of that medicine doesn't realize, because it has been secularized in a sense, but you'd think they'd understand this more, is that the body has a significant role in these psychiatric disorders, right? And we don't really treat it like that outside of, oh, well, we gave these drugs that are supposed to affect serotonin, so we're going to now assume that you have a serotonin deficiency and that's what's causing it, as opposed to a metabolic deficiency, which is, but the interesting thing is when you correlate like obesity and diabetes, and oh, well, they correlate with all these diseases. No one thinks there's a universal cause like metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance to it. They kind of just ignore it. I remember, for all the women listening to podcasts who are dealing with infertility, I remember being in a lecture in medical school being told like PCOS causes insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction. So PCOS is polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is probably the most common cause of infertility among females. And you have a situation where essentially you have insulin resistance that leads to problems with respect to the ovaries and your overall hormonal functions. Well, at that lecture, it was essentially said causality was the opposite. PCOS causes insulin resistance, but if I give a drug called metformin to insulin sensitize people, not a drug that affects directly on the ovaries, all of a sudden the PCOS gets better. So that's backwards in terms of causality, right? If I fix if I'm fixing a consequence of a problem, I should not be able to fix the underlying problem.
Right.
Right. And that's one of those things where if we think about, well, we won't get into Joseph Kellogg and why he started Kellogg's to essentially neuter the entire population by pumping them full of wheat. But he's a Seventh-day Adventist, so that's not surprising.
So he's Malthusian, right? Wasn't that? Yeah, I think I've heard that before.
No, it wasn't Malthusian from a population
No?
perspective. It was an anti-concupiscence thing.
Okay.
He was essentially trying to curb the libidos of all these people in order to reduce sins of the flesh. And then when he died, Kellogg's was run by different people who obviously kept the wheat, but then added the sugar to the cereals. Because it used to just be like just pure, let's pump everyone full of wheat. And the Seventh-day Adventists actually run a university that's actually quite prominent in terms of plant-based regulations and things like that. It's called Loma Linda. So the Loma Linda University in California, yeah, that's a Seventh-day. Essentially, it was built by Seventh-day Adventists, and it is a plant-based like haven, essentially, from that perspective. But you can think like all these women who are told, oh, well, your PCOS is like, you just need to, but they'll tell also people to lose weight, which is also probably a sign of trying to get metabolically more healthy. But you think of all the babies that weren't born, all the women that, suffered with infertility, wanting to live up to their vocation. I know that, Harrison Butker being in the news is all the rage now, though I wish he had mentioned that the religious life is actually the highest calling for it. But second would be motherhood. And how many people felt like they, for whatever reason, there was something intrinsically wrong with them when they were just, they've been told like, oh, well, you should be avoiding fat. You should be avoiding cholesterol, consume these essentially this industrial sludge that you call canola oil, which was essentially popularized after Canada lost the market for canola oil as industrial lubricant in World War II, or cottonseed oil.
This is true, folks. We are not two crazy people having a podcast, right? You could look this stuff up. That was one of the wildest things that sent me down a rabbit hole. That was like, wait a second, what?
Yeah, yeah.
Wait,
If you're
what are
wondering
we? What are they feeding us in the U.S.? It was literally, yeah, right. It was almost like banned as a lubrication. Wild,
Canola oil
wild.
stands for Canadian oil low acid because there is a certain acid in rapeseed oil that is actually quite toxic. So it's essentially a different version of rapeseed oil. And it had its big market in World War II. And we can talk to, a million times about how the military industrial complex were having wars destroy nations in different ways than you would think. So, for example, the rise in smoking, if you look at a graph of American rise in smoking, it actually rises most in World War II and in World War I. And that's because every GI got cigarettes.
Mm-hmm. True.
So people are coming back, never having smoked before the war, and they're smoking like chimneys because they were smoking. I mean, and you see that in Nam to a different degree with heroin abuse, right? And a lot of drug use in Vietnam. So
I hope they weren't shipping the soldiers heroin. At least I hope they didn't go that far.
Well, so it
Close,
depends
maybe.
on which drug dealers you listen to about,
Right.
having heroin shipped back in body bags, right? And who they were willing to fund in Cambodia, right? With respect to, and in Laos, and with respect to that, you don't know. And I mean, obviously there were studies in terms of doing, in terms of, giving people different medication or different drugs. I mean, it's not just the Nazis who tried amphetamines on their own troops, right? In terms of that, like, I'm sure we only know so much in terms of, like, MK Ultra and all this kind of stuff and
Right.
all that. I mean, we won't know that until the United States regime essentially falls in those.
It's a great point. I mean, they have released MK Ultra, Paperclip, these different things that are shocking. You hear it, you're like, no, that can't be true. It's like, no, they released it. That's for sure. Just imagine exactly as you say. Imagine what they haven't released. It is way, way, way more than what they have. So it's a terrifying thing, and it's going off topic, but it does show. I mean, I think it's sobering to remember that the United States of America has not been the good guys for a long time. I mean, I always say that I think, the way I visualize it, I suppose, is that I think that America kind of lost its soul, quote unquote, when they dropped the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I think that it seems, and I think they were doing bad stuff before then too, probably. Yeah. I mean, but that's when it seems like, then it's like, okay, morality's gone. We don't care about it. The government's like, hey, we will do anything at all to get ahead. And they did pretty much.
I think there's, if we want to get into that subject, I think there's various points you can point to. I personally point to the Constitution as the death of America. Because of the coup against the Articles of Confederation, because essentially there was not supposed to be a central government. It was supposed to be a compact of states. It was essentially supposed to be a defense compact among states. Sure. That's essentially what it was. And this is where, I mean, this is getting a little bit off topic. This is where I'm going to say the Constitution is not, the religious liberty in the Constitution is not really religious liberty. What it is that the federal government that was set up by the Constitution was not supposed to be able to govern the states in this manner. The states were free. Maryland was free to essentially be a Catholic state, an apologetic Catholic state. The federal government was not allowed to, because the sovereignty did not lie in the federal government. That completely flips on its head if we're going to talk about another death date for the United States. Well, you could talk about how the Whiskey Rebellion was put down and, like, essentially the spirit of the Constitution was dead. You can talk about Abraham Lincoln, who probably killed the idea that the United States are versus the United States is. So essentially, right, where the federal government was not supreme, now all of a sudden this Constitution is now the supreme law of every land. Because if you have a state law that's against the U.S. Constitution or against what the federal government wants, well, now Lincoln has showed through a force of strength and manipulating all history. Well, I mean, it's history being written by the victors. People will say, "Oh, the compact theory of the Union was not like a real thing." Thomas Woods writes about this in a book called Nullification. That was, and then all of a sudden after Lincoln, it's like, oh no, we always existed as the United States, and the states exist at the luxury or at the beneficence of the federal government, which is completely backwards. Then you have, I would say, the Woodrow Wilson administration with the
absolutely
right World War One is probably the original sin of the 20th century with respect to that. Now, granted, I think you could definitely argue that it was a response to the democratization and the removal from, essentially the removal, we're removing, if you're taking the Catholic point of view, you're going from medieval history where you have limited monarchs though, right? I mean, like even the Catholic monarchs of France wanted to act Protestant in the sense that they could run things right without essentially being bound by the laws of well,
Sure.
divine law, or church law. Um, so you have this kind of, essentially, when you erode the Catholic base of these nations, like the United States, you have these vestiges of morality, sometimes just natural law morality. But then as you increase the this belief that humans are their own gods, well, then they can make their own laws, right? And and you'll see this with this kind of notion of democracy in this country has moved into, well, if the government makes, if vox populi, vox dei, right? The idea that the voice of the people is the voice of God. If they vote 51% for something, all of a sudden it's, you know what? Even if I don't like it, it's okay because that's what, people want. And that kind of standard of morality is nonsensical, but it kind of fits with this notion of, well, we can make society or individual bodies or individual souls, if I believe in a soul, in whatever image I want them to be.
Well, and it kind of comes back into this, idea again. It's humanistic. Pius the Saint Pius the Tenth warned us about modernism, and I think part of that is it's the combination of all heresies. Part of that is humanistic. That it's been going on since Luther. And I got to say, Doctor, I mean, the fact that we go from nutrition to talking about the United States and the Constitution, I love it. I'm going to have you on again, Doctor. That is absolutely certain. That's the type of show that I love. I hope everyone sticks with us.
Well, there's another quick thing. Like if you see, so there's a guy named Weston Price. He was a dentist back in the day. He's pretty famous in these kind of like more natural circles of health. He was able to fly along with a guy named Stephenson, who actually went on an all meat diet. They were able to have planes in the early 1900s where they were able to fly out to areas where they should see indigenous people and how they lived, but there weren't planes and supply lines to get them westernized food. So they could actually see all these diseases that were common in Western nations that did not exist among these people, whether it's the Maasai or the Inuit or whatever these groups are. But then almost to a T, when you bring these people this westernized food or Western habits or smoking or alcohol, their health falls off a cliff. Or when people want to make, and this is another annoying thing in medicine, is that, oh, well, it's genetic or it runs in my family. Well, the very common thing that runs in your family is, well, we all eat together, right? Yeah. We have a lot of the same habits. We have the same exposures. Yeah. So to chalk it up to, well, it's in my family history, so it must be genetic. So if I have, heart disease, then it's just like, oh, it's just something I can't control because it's just, if I get it, it's
every time my dad ate chocolate cake, he got sick. And man, I tell you, when I eat a full chocolate cake, I get sick too. Man, why did you have to pass this down to me, Dad? Well, no, it makes sense though. No, yeah.
And the other thing is like even the hardest core Darwinist is not going to say that your genetics change in 3 years, or not 3 years, sorry, 3 generations, right? Like how many diabetic and obese people were there in 1930, right? Or even 1970?
Not that many. Yeah, right? You see pictures of it. You watch videos of yeah, exactly. 1920s, 30s, 40s, 60s, 70s. I'm sure there were obese people, but not that much.
Not nearly to the degree where you're almost having like 50% of people being overweight or obese. Like the idea that it's genetic, I think, is just, again, to normalize it. It is to normalize a disease as well. This happens to everybody, but also to say it's out of your control. So therefore, you must rely on the great engineers of the human body, whether it's a pharmaceutical company or a medical society or whatever. And in another way, it does keep people trapped in that regard. Like if you become one of my patients and I get you healthy, right? You might feel well enough. You might not that I can, you might feel well enough where you're like, hey doc, I have the principles in place. I can keep myself pretty healthy, where maybe you could live like your grandmother, who probably didn't need to, or not your grandmother, probably your great grandmother, who did not need to see a doctor every 3 months in order to feel like she could live her life.
And so, people are sitting there thinking, some people are, yeah, but the quality, not the quality of life, the lifespan, they all, most of the people died younger, that's back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they didn't have as long of lives. What would you say to that?
So there's reasons there's a couple things to look at. One, you'd want to look at conditional life expectancy. So for example, if one of the big killers of people was death in childbirth, you're going to have a lot of young women and a lot of children who are dying, who will drag down the average, right? This is basic math. You essentially have a skewed distribution, right? You have a fat tail in the lower age ranges that will drag down the average. So what you'd want is a conditional probability. But at the same time, if you think that grain-based diets and stuff like that are bad for health, then yeah, we were kind of torching our immune systems a little bit anyway with respect to living a high carb diet. And you were going to then suffer from issues with, any kind of infections and things like that, prior to the advent of antibiotics. So again, like we were saying before, if you break your leg, you want a surgeon, right? If you get shot, you want someone to take the bullet out of you, right? If you get a severe infection, right? Back in the Civil War, they just amputate your leg. Like they didn't have antibiotics at the time. So it's not to say that medicine does not have benefits, but their benefits seem to be in the acute, oh goodness, I need someone to help me in this moment. But medicine has been an absolute failure, it would seem, with anything related to chronic disease. Because now I will say, from the flip side, there is it is dishonest, I think, to say to look at number one, numbers, the most frequent causes of mortality, and say, oh, all of a sudden heart disease has risen to the top or whatever. Because essentially, if you're just doing it based on a ranking, well, if all of a sudden tuberculosis is not killing people because you have antibiotics, then that will drop and something will have to rise to the top. So that it's not an honest way to say it in terms of just ranking them, but just in terms of the number of people suffering from them, or the percentage of the population as population has grown. That's more honest. But yeah, it's hard to make heads or tails of life expectancy data until you fix that kind of notion. You have to remove the skews from essentially people dying young. Imagine if you took a life expectancy during World War I, when so many young people were just dying, young men, right? So it becomes a very difficult thing. And some of it also comes from moving into cities, right? In cities that didn't have, the greatest sanitation system, right? One of the reasons for, one of the benefits of cars was how much horse manure.
We just talked about that this week. Yeah, I just talked about that on Monday. It was a serious problem. They had too much horse poop.
Right. And you have issues of even lead in pipes in Britain, from times of the Romans. People just didn't know these types of things. Every kind of intervention, has any kind of intervention that man makes in the world has a cost, right? As I think Thomas Sowell once famously said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Right? In terms of any intervention that you make, right? There's always going to be a plus and a benefit. The question is, do the positives outweigh the negatives, right? From that perspective, because there's never a free lunch. There's never something that is without any kind of cost whatsoever, even opportunity cost.
So, right. Because if not, we'd all be on oxycodone or cocaine or something, right? That just makes sense just practically, right? Because if drugs didn't have a side effect, then everybody would be doing them. Okay, it's morally wrong anyway, too, of course. But just the idea that it makes sense.
There are people, and we can get into you notice some of the, when we get to depression and mental health, and from looking at them as diseases of both body and spirit. You do see the saints, and you see them undergo insane amounts of trauma, right? Or things that would be deemed trauma, right? And come out of them holier. So there is, it's not enough to say that you were just a victim of something like that. How you respond to trauma is very important. And there's a body component to that, but there's also a spiritual component to that. As the gospel reading for Pentecost, it says, right? My peace I give you, not as the world gives you peace, right? And that peace from Christ is something that, if you do have anxiety, I don't think it harms you at all. If you can recognize that things are out of your control, that they are in God's hands, and that, your ordering of your life towards your salvation is probably actually quite helpful in a naturalistic sense as well, with respect to, these kind of psychiatric diseases, because we can kind of view it in certain ways, because certain groups of people who have certain types of lifestyles that the Catholic Church would deem disordered tend to also have much higher incidence of psychiatric disease. Some people will argue it's because society hasn't accepted them for who they want to say they are, who they want to be. But from a Catholic perspective, it would seem that they are more, at risk of these diseases because their intellects are disordered. Right, and because their intellects are disordered, there is an inherent conflict, because, getting back to the original purpose, if you believe that we are made by God in the image of God, and that we are made for a purpose, deviation from that purpose would lead to conflict. It would lead to something not that by whatever sense, hopefully a Catholic sense, that something is not right, with respect to that. And you're trying to essentially fit a square peg into a round hole with these disordered lifestyles and to try to justify them. And it's one of the great, you talk about charity, right? And some people from a naturalistic point of view will say, well, these people, you should affirm them in what they do and things like that because that's charitable. And in reality, it's not. In reality, it's not, because if you told no one would tell a schizophrenic who thinks that, they can fly, that, what you should do is you slap some wings on them and let them jump off a building. No one would say that's charity. But when it comes to certain disorders, right, people are essentially saying that as a form of charity. You have to affirm them and, do things for them to help them feel like, oh, well, their view of themselves is actually reality, right? Whether it's surgeries or medications or hormones or whatever it may be. And that becomes not charity, but it's almost like giving an alcoholic a drink. It's the opposite. You're essentially having them double down on what's causing their issues, and it's a major issue.
Well, and I think that, and I totally agree. I think I'd see in society, because I'm sure as you cross this with different times when you have this conversation with people who don't think like we do, and I think part of the issue is that people can't see outside of their own, view, and it's kind of black and white. So if they tell you this, okay, yeah, it's charitable to affirm them, if they're a boy who wants to be a girl or whatever. And so I think what they see, like almost in their own mind, when they think, okay, if you don't affirm them, then you're literally going up to these mentally sick people and punching them in the face or screaming at them and saying, I hate you, you belong in hell. Or that, I think that's actually what the other side thinks. They visualize it as this just absolute extreme if you're not on their side of being the super charitable, loving people who accept people for how they are. And it's just that I think that's kind of how the world has pushed us, right? It's pushed us all to these extremes of thought, where the Catholic Church teaches that oftentimes, very usually, the truth is in the middle. Now, not in the case of dysphoria and stuff, obviously, but I mean, in how you treat people, of course, we always treat people charitably, but that's not the question. It's not about how you treat them. It's exactly as you said. It's, hey, you don't want to support someone in doing something crazy.
Right. And I mean, like, there are some instances where it's a lack of supernatural charity and a disordering in the sense that, love of God comes first and then love of man comes second. And love of man is actually secondary to love of God. So it's not even that they're ranked separately. It's that they're inextricably linked. It's you love your wife or your neighbor, et cetera, because you love God. Right. When you strip that notion out, then, and you've made, kind of man into his own God. And then we can get into, that's a long discussion on Pascendi, right? Like if you believe that the vital immanence of your natural life is essentially, right, to borrow the phrase, right? If you have this kind of viewpoint that is essentially a welling from your own self about your own experience, then all of a sudden, well, you're just a human, I'm just a human. Who has the authority actually to say, that this is wrong or that is wrong or this is a bad lifestyle, this is a good lifestyle? Right? It's almost like at that point, it's like, well, we just have to help each other live. Oh, sorry. Like, what's the term that people like to use? To live our own lives or to make the best of my best self. Or
live your truth, isn't that it?
That's actually. I think that was the phrase.
Live your truth.
That's the phrase.
There's one truth, guys. It's not everybody else's truth. But that's again. But back to St. Pius X. That's relativism, right? It's modernism. It's absolutely true. Yeah. But I think so. I'm really convinced that we have to get out of here before an hour. I'm really trying. It's not because of you, doctor. It's because I'm trying to do that with all of my shows. I think we always go over an hour, and I think I think YouTube's kind of like, okay, guys, come on, stay a little under. So we're gonna try to keep this under an hour. So I really want. I seriously, doctor, I could talk to you for another 2. Like this has been, it's gone by way too fast. We're gonna definitely have to have you on again if you would come on again. But I want to ask you, I guess, the final question for this show. Because we talked about nutrition, we talked about a bunch of things, but nutrition is the primary one. So let's talk about me now. Not me. Let's say hypothetical, because I don't want you to give me advice over a podcast.
Quick disclaimer: none of this is medical advice. Please consult your doctor, or if you are in the Florida area and you want my advice, please sign up for the medical practice so that legally I can give you medical advice.
No, exactly. Thank you for saying that, because that is really important. That again, right now we are just talking as opinions. Now, I value your opinion much higher than mine because you have this training, but it is not official advice. So again, yes, please. We'll get your contact details or a way to contact you. I know people are going to have questions after this, doctor. So maybe we'll have an email or we'll figure that out after or as we go along. But my question for you. So hypothetically, someone is, 30 years old. They're a little overweight. They're tired pretty often. They have a little bit of stomach troubles. What, and I know this is going to be hard for you to say briefly, but I mean, what would you basically start them out as? What are you just going to say day one? Hey, no more sugar, gone.
So you have to. So this is where I think another problem with modern medicine is that everything's guideline based. So we can get into the consequences of inflation and how it mass produces society because it's actually cheaper to run things because prices for actual quality and individualized things end up becoming more expensive than they would be in an inflationary setting. But when you have someone in this kind of situation come in, you actually have to just individualize it each one. You have to meet them where they are. So you have to know, right? If you're having these kind of issues, I want to know, one, what medications you're on, what your eating habits are, what your lifestyle is, how much sleep do you get, how restful is your sleep? Do you look like someone who may have sleep apnea, right? And from that perspective, with respect to your fatigue, are you someone who is chronically stressed, right? Are you someone who works night shifts and is just burning the candle at both ends? There's so many different things, and then you have to be willing to know what a person is willing to do. So, for example, when I was in residency and I started this, I was completely alone. Heck, when I got off coffee, I was in the middle of fourth year of medical school and the first year of residency. After fourth year of medical school, like once you're done with your major rotations, it's pretty cake. After graduation, you have like essentially 2 months off. So I went off coffee. I spent 3 days in bed and 3 weeks in withdrawal. But if you've got a job, right? You can't just go cold turkey like that because you have responsibilities, right? Things like that. So you have to just meet everyone where they're at with respect to that. And are there particular labs that I would get, things like that? Yes. Like there are things that I would look for, mainly to look at measures of insulin resistance, things like that. So like a fasting insulin level, which is commonly not ordered, is something I would do. A craft test might be a little bit hard, but that's essentially measuring insulin levels after you consume a glucose load, like how women do oral glucose tolerance tests during pregnancy. In America, at least, I don't know about Europe, but you would drink this and then they would measure your insulin levels at 0, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. And based on that curve, you can tell how degree of insulin resistance to someone. But overall, like if you were going to eliminate one thing from your diet, if that's really what you're kind of getting at from a nutrition standpoint, I would say that it would be seed oils. I would say that personally. And, there's, like I said, there are different camps. There's the refined carbs camp. There's the sugar camp. There's the carbs camp in general. There's the seed oil camp. And then obviously it also should depend on like what you're trying to accomplish. Like if you have an autoimmune disease, you might need to be more intense about eliminating plant foods. I know you've talked about Jordan Peterson before, but actually in the nutrition space, Michaela Peterson, his daughter, is actually much more famous because she had a bunch of autoimmune conditions, was infertile, was told she could never have a child, and actually went on a Lion's diet, which is just beef, salt, water. And she actually was able to have a child and cured all of these inflammatory conditions. But if she brings back any kind of things off of that, her symptoms spike. So it depends on everything that, what your goals are and where you're at in life. But the first thing I would say is, eliminate the seed oils, because essentially I think a lot of these inflammation issues are due to essentially having too much of a precursor called linoleic acid, which is a particular polyunsaturated fat. And when it's not the acid per se, but it's the metabolites of it. Just like it's not a bad idea to have gasoline in your house, but if the gasoline goes on fire, right, you've got a problem. So the linoleic acid is a precursor to a lot of inflammatory things, and they're oxidized metabolites. In the literature, they're called oxalams. And it's tricky in the literature because they won't talk about, like there aren't papers that they'll talk about those oxidized metabolites, but they'll never refer it back to the linoleic acid, which is why a lot of doctors, I think, struggle because they see so many patients. It's hard for them to actually spend time digging through the literature. You end up having to rely on people like Tucker Goodrich, who's pretty good on these kind of like matter of seed oils. But those are the things, especially since the 70s when the United States started subsidizing soy and corn. Soy and corn turned into oils in order to meet the demand, to deal with the excess supply, and became so prevalent in that. And we have studies, they can give intralipid, which is like a TPN. So essentially nutrition through the IV that's based on soybean oil, and that'll cause fatty liver. In fact, it'll cause fatty liver in infants. And the cure for that is actually like in preemies who don't have a gut digestive tract, so they can't even take, formula or like, not formula, sorry, like even donated breast milk because their guts haven't developed. And the actual cure for that is Omegaven, which is a fish oil based TPN, or fish oil based nutrition through the IV. So we can see this kind of like omega-6, omega-3 balance issue that eliminating the seed oils is probably the one that's going to be not the easiest in terms of execution, but probably the least withdrawal effects. And I think the most bang for your buck. In America, you also have the problem of chicken and pork because of the soy and corn they get fed. Because they're one stomach animals, their fat content is kind of like they are what they eat, kind of like a person. So, they end up becoming, if you're thinking about linoleic acid percentages, canola is like 25. The ancestral diet is about 2 to 4%, by the way. Canola is about 25, soybeans about 50, peanuts about 35, sunflower, safflower is about 75%. Chicken and corn, when they're fed this corn and soy, are about 16 to 20%, whereas beef is about 2%. So even if you're eating the lowest quality beef, it's probably healthier than the highest quality chicken or pork that you can probably get your hands on. Now, again, I don't know what that is like. That's like in Germany or Bavaria, but in America we have essentially a clear problem with all this. And to be honest, one of the priests actually went to Europe, and he has diabetes, and he was eating the food in Europe, and he's like, my blood sugar wasn't nearly like I was eating similar things, and the blood sugar wasn't nearly as spiking, and my gut issues weren't nearly as much there as if I was eating what I think is like the equivalent in America. So
Well, I've seen videos where they show how many things are illegal throughout Europe and are legal in America. And that makes it, to me, it's fairly clear that there are more regulations here, and it's another topic about regulations and FDA, and that's a tough one. Yeah.
Judy Cho has a great chapter in her book called, I believe, The Carnivore Cure, which actually goes through all these different compounds and foods and things like that have been banned in Europe for decades that are still. So I definitely recommend that book to anybody who's like interested in the carnivore diet. Very good book.
And that's a good place to have my last question for you, Doctor. What do you eat? So you say we have to watch someone who is not a big heavy sumo wrestler telling us how to eat. So now I'm curious. Now I'm really curious. So, what on earth do you eat?
So yesterday I ate. So my son was eating. My wife calls them pancakes, but he's a 2-year-old. He eats about like 7 eggs a day for breakfast, or he's like 7 eggs for breakfast. But he was like, I'd come back from work, so like a week of working at the hospital. So he wanted to eat with me, so we split. It was like one he feeds me, and then he'll eat a bite, and that helps him actually eat, so he doesn't like to start playing instead of eating. And then I ate about 2 pounds of beef cheeks for dinner. But generally, I'll eat 2 to 3 pounds of beef in a sitting. Today, I won't be eating anything just because, one of the things that you find when you eat a very low carb diet is fasting becomes a little easy. And from a penance standpoint, or from a mortification of the body standpoint, you do end up having to do probably a little bit more to actually be truly mortifying the body, just because it is a little effortless for me to fast for a day and eating one meal.
And so that's because that's because of the diet. Go ahead.
Yeah. So getting back to this idea of essentially carbs, this gets into there's an interesting presentation done by Dr. Tro Kalajian, who runs the Low Carb MD podcast. And he's a great presentation on how glucose variation. So let's say you eat a meal and your glucose goes up. I don't know what the European units are, so I'm going to use American units. I'm sorry for any European listeners, but let's say your glucose is normally at like a 90 and you go up to 110 and then you go back to 90. You haven't actually gone hypoglycemic or low, but your body, in sensing that drop in blood sugar, will make you want to eat again. So regardless of how many calories you eat and things like that, those variations in glucose are enough to trigger hunger in people. So when you're eating a no carb diet, you don't really have those glucose fluctuations as much. And that in part is probably why you're more satiated. And I think it's actually a more nutrient dense diet in a lot of ways. So your body is more going to search for nutrients than calories. Obviously, if you're really calorie deficient, you're going to get fatigued, things like that. And generally, your body will be hungry if it needs more nutrients. So eating a more nutrient dense diet combined with lowering these fluctuations in blood glucose, I think fix a lot of those hunger signals. But yeah, mostly I eat beef. On Fridays, I'll either eat nothing or I'll eat seafood. We actually have eggs. So getting back to the linoleic acid issue, I actually raise chickens. I have some cows and goats too. But I actually feed them coconut as their fat source because it's high in saturated fat in order to drive down that linoleic acid for that reason.
Interesting. So how do you eat your beef steaks? I mean, you just grilling them up, putting a little salt on them, and.
So I personally like beef. I personally am a big fan of beef cheeks. One, they're dirt cheap to get around here because nobody really eats them, but they're really high. I like highly collagenous kind of like meat sources. So some with a lot of connective tissue because it comes in a gelatin, and I kind of like that how that is with respect to like braising cuts. So I just put them in an oven for like at like 300 degrees for 3 hours. And if I want to work out, then I'll work out around like an hour to go before they're done, and then eat right after that. So yeah, it actually is pretty liberating in a sense, because like, let's say you wanted to be really simple and you just wanted to eat 2 pounds of like hamburger and patties or in ground beef. Like, you don't have to spend your entire day thinking like, oh, what am I going to cook? How am I going to go to the grocery store? What do I have to buy? All these kind of things. It's actually quite liberating if you do embrace it, because you're like, I just need meat and I need salt and I need heat. And it actually simplifies life. And for people who spend a lot of time trying to figure out what they're going to eat, how they're going to get it, stuff like that, it's a huge time saver. And it's just mentally like really nice to be like, yeah, I like like the food situation is not something I think about. It's just like, you can focus on other things that are more important and get things done, as opposed to spending 2 hours in a grocery store or something like that, or trying to roam through your pantry trying to figure out what goes with what.
Yeah, I saw it was kind of funny that I don't know if you know who Bear Grylls is. He was a TV presenter. How do I describe Bear Grylls? Anyway, he was a former British military operative who did a survival show, and I saw a tweet or Facebook or something where he said that he was giving up the vegan diet, and I'm pretty positive. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure he said he was giving up a vegan diet for the carnivore diet. It just kind of blew my mind. It's like, boy, that's quite the quite the flip. But it's interesting because clearly, you know,
A
he
lot of
was
people,
couldn't find it with the vegan stuff, and he's just like, hey, I want something that makes me healthy.
I
Interesting.
think a lot of people, except for your kind of, I think people who are deranged with respect to the animal rights kind of nonsense. I think people seek out a vegan diet because I think they do understand implicitly or explicitly the problems with the modern American diet, or the standard American diet, which we can abbreviate as SAD, because it is a sad diet. And they understand a lot of the junk, and they're trying to get away from that, but they're trying to get away with that from that in the context of still being like following what the mainstream advice is, right? Because the mainstream advice is not to eat a ton of meat or to eat a ton of butter, right? The mainstream advice is to eat like plenty of plants, whole grains, things like that. So if you're trying to, better your health, you would think, oh, maybe the vegan thing is the way to go, until you realize, one, it's nutritionally deficient because there are amino acids that you can only get through meat, certain B vitamins, carnitine, et cetera, that you don't produce that greatly, that really just come from meat sources better than anything else. And then we can get into the whole issue of plant toxins, whether it's oxalates, lectins, phytates, et cetera, that can cause people problems. Like Liam Hemsworth, like Thor, right? Thor's brother, Liam Hemsworth, actually got a bunch of kidney stones because he was pounding kale smoothies, which have a ton of oxalate in them. But that's a thing, right? Like these green smoothies and stuff like that have huge oxalate loads. And these people get these kidney stones sometimes because they're just consuming copious amounts of oxalates. And that's another thing from a naturalistic kind of perspective. You never had access to fruits and vegetables 24/7, 365 days of the year. Like, things were in season, out of season, right? You may have access to various meat sources 365 days a year, but you never had access to particular plant sources 365 days of the year. Sure. And whether you're able to tolerate what's in some plants with respect to toxins, because they do have, and you see this in the animal and botany literature, like animals have to come up with ways to fight off essentially these plant toxins in order to be able to extract the amount of nutrients that they need from them and to be able to eat them. But like, everyone responds differently. So for example, caffeine makes me fragment my sleep. It gave me 3 times a week headaches when I was drinking coffee. That went away when I got off of it. I had like all this jaw tightness, not like grinding, but I felt like a rubber band was around my jaw, and it all went away. My dad can drink a coffee at 10 and fall asleep at 11. So everyone's kind of different with respect to how they can tolerate that kind of stuff. And you see with my daughter, actually, my wife was eating, beef with, kind of like some coconut curry, like with some Thai spices. She got rid of it, but my daughter was dealing with, she's about 3 months old. She was dealing with, like heat-induced eczema. So she would just get these rashes on her face, and she would scratch the snot out. But now she's been eating just beef and eggs, and it's completely gone away. So something was probably going from her diet into her breast milk. And it's also something that we notice with our children.
I'm sorry, real quickly. I'm so glad you said that. I was seriously thinking you meant that your 3-month-old was eating just beef steaks and eggs. I was
Oh,
really like, man, that's that's impressive. But
well,
like now I got you. That makes a little more sense. Like,
So my
man,
what,
your
you know,
daughter's
what
tough.
was what was in the breast milk
I gotcha. I
was
gotcha.
probably translating over, and she was having a reaction to. And it's actually interesting. Like, this is a side note. These kids that I have, I've just grown like weeds. Like I'm what 5'8". My wife's 5'5", and like little Xavier, who's 2.5, has been like 90th percentile in height his entire time. And he mostly eats. He's about as big as most like 4-year-olds. Like
Well,
we go to the park, and he's just like he's like he's like in a little soccer thing, and like all these other kids are like 3, 4, and he's about their same size, and he's 2.5. So it is, and that gets into Kevin Stock is a dentist who actually talks about this, that potentially the lack of protein has led to like poor jaw development in a lot of kids, and leads them to, issues with breathing in the long run, whether it's more likely to have sleep apnea, or more likely to be mouth breathers, or things like that. So, it's an interesting thing to think, like very basic things, even from the womb sometimes, what kids are exposed to when their mom is eating can set them in certain, directions with respect to their health, let alone like, formula, which is essentially seed oils and sugar, which, kind of to bring it full circle with respect to the animals and things like that. Everyone knows how to fatten up an animal. Every farmer knows how to fatten up an animal. You give it seed oils or seed oil meals, you give it sugar, and you give it grains. So it's no different in terms of fattening up a person, but we make it a lot more complicated, I think, than it is.
amen to that, boy, doctor. I think we better call it, because I
Mhm.
could totally go 2 hours with you today. We'll have to do it again. So many things that we could talk about in the future. I hope you come back. I greatly appreciated it. Very, very interesting. I I'm going to have to look more into the carnivore diet. I just, I'm sure you understand. There's part of me is just like, no, I could never do it. I could never do. But you know what? I also want to feel healthier than I do right now. So it's definitely something worth thinking about. And I think that people out there listening to this, that's literally the only thing I would suggest. I mean, I'm certainly no medical professional. Don't just poo poo it. Don't just be like, oh no, no way. At least consider it. And I think that's with a lot of things. I think that a lot of the issues with medicine, I think it's just because like that's how it's done. That's how you do it. Of course you take the pills the doctor prescribes. Well, what happened, a couple of years ago when the doctor prescribed a vaccine? So I mean, I think it's good to remember that sometimes you just need to sit back and say, okay, yeah, okay, maybe there's some sense here. There is some sense here.
So some
Uh,
books I can recommend your readers probably could
sure,
go to
please.
is, one is Lies My Doctor Told Me by Dr. Ken Berry. That's in its second edition. The Carnivore Cure by by Judy Cho. The Carnivore Code, which is by Dr. Sean Baker, who, if people who watch Rogan and stuff like that probably know who Sean Baker is, from that perspective, because he was on there a couple times. Another book would be Fiat Food, which actually goes into how central banking and inflation actually promoted the food environment that we have today.
Hmm.
Um, and then finally, Nina Teichholz, who's a kind of journalist, more of a journalist, wrote a great book called The Big Fat Surprise, which is kind of America, like the war on fat. And for a shorter read, there is a Guardian article from 2017 called, I believe, The Sugar Conspiracy by Ian Leslie, that actually goes into kind of the research and the, I would say, the dubious academic nature of a man named Ansel Keys, and how a man named another researcher named Robert Goodkin was kind of swept underneath the rug, to say the least. And it kind of gets me to this idea of Dr. Alfred Semmelweis, who told doctors back in the 1800s, I believe, that they should wash their hands instead of going to the morgue, exhuming bodies, and then seeing patients because they were getting them sick. And he was laughed out of medicine. And I think he actually committed suicide. I don't know if he had any mental health issues or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but turns out he was right. But that's one of the things that you realize, is that even if you're saying like, well, all these doctors say this, that, or the other thing, one, look at the evidence and see, have we gotten healthier with these recommendations or not? But also that, plurality doesn't mean anything with respect to truth. It may be useful in saying that, like, well, some people, if more people believe this, maybe there's an increased probability of it being the truth. But in no way can you take that as certainty, that just because 9 out of 10 doctors or 4 out of 5 dentists say this, that, or the other thing, that it must be the truth.
Amen to that, Doctor. And I guess the last question: how do you want people contacting you? You sound like a very busy man. I don't know if you want people asking questions. I can also have
No,
them send
I have
questions to me first,
I
or
have
how do you
no
want to play that?
problems. I have no problems with people reaching out to me to ask questions. I guess
Hmm.
the issue becomes, again, as a doctor, I am held to kind of like a higher standard in terms
Of
of
course,
these kind of things. So if you're asking me for medical advice, or if you're asking me how to start XYZ thing, I really can't answer those kind of questions without, like, from a legal perspective, and I think from a knowing your complete picture perspective, I would have to be your doctor with respect to that. If you wanted to ask me a question of like, hey, what's a good book on XYZ thing? Or like, is this a good, like, is there a good like Twitter account or something like that to follow on XYZ subject? I'm more than happy to ask that question. If you happen to be in the state of Florida and you need your help, you can actually become one of my patients outside the state of Florida. No, but it is one of those things that's a little bit tricky. But I have no problems answering questions. So there is a Twitter. Sorry, I keep saying Twitter. X.
I do too. It's still Twitter in my mind. Yeah,
There is a Twitter page for the practice for Florida low carb direct primary care. The website itself is lowcarbdpc.com, and the email address is Florida low carb dpc at protonmail.com. Either one of those ways to contact me is fine. And obviously, if you want to become a patient, feel free to contact me about that, and I can let you know if we could make that happen. Obviously, I'm only licensed in the state of Florida, so you'd have to be in the state of Florida for me to be your doctor.
I know.
Um,
I know. We have quite a few listeners in Florida, so those of you guys out there, if you're interested, definitely do that. Again, Doctor, I greatly appreciate it. I'll try to attach. Maybe you could email me those links to contact you, and I will attach them to this video. Otherwise, again, as I said, I hope to have you on again. It was very, very interesting. I love the way we kind of weaved around the topic. We talked a little bit about Constitution, a little bit about morality and theology, a tiny
you
bit, but mostly nutrition. That's the best type of show. I love it.
you can only imagine what conversations between me and Mr. Kegeso are like then.
Oh, I can't even. Yeah, totally. I want to be there when it. Someday we'll all be together in Florida or Bavaria or in Cincinnati, and we'll have a steak. I suppose. I guess we'll sit down
There
and
we go.
we'll have a steak. All right, perfect, Doctor. It's been fantastic. Until next time, God bless you, and enjoy whatever your next meal will be. I suppose. Everyone, please like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Please let us know what you think. What do you think about what you've heard? Nutrition, the carnivore diet. Again, to me too, it's a shocking. I've heard about this before, of course. I'm also kind of like, oh, that sounds extreme. But again, this video makes me definitely consider it less crazy. I will totally, totally say that. And I appreciate that as well. That now I have a better perspective on literally what it is, and that maybe it's something actually worth looking into. Until next time, Doctor. God bless you. Everyone else, you as well. We'll see you next time.
Thank thank you for having me on, Mr. Davis, and a blessed Ember week to you all.